Okay. Next, we move on to a story that came, sort of to my surprise, from Chester. Now, Chester, growing up in North Wales, Chester was the nearest quote unquote big city to me. It's a town, basically. It's a very large town, but it is also a city because it has a cathedral and so on and so forth. Um, and it is famous for being encompassed by Roman walls that one suspects has been dressed over time, particularly in the Victorian era, to tidy it up a little bit, and so on and so forth. But essentially, it is a Roman town.
We started off as the Roman colonia of Diva, as the base of oh god, what was it the 14th Legion at one point?
I think it was the
It was
ninth.
the ninth in York, the second in
I
Gloucester.
know ninth was in York. Yeah, actually, I lived in
Yeah,
York for too long. I've
yeah.
forgotten what the Legion in
It began
Chester
life
was.
as a legionary fortress anyway.
Yes,
It was
anyway, yeah. They,
there were two, one at either end. Those wretched rebellious Welsh. They had a legion at either end to keep them in check.
as opposed to the compliant English, yes. Um, so anyway, Chester started out as a Roman fort. They actually built the bathhouse in my hometown, in Prestatyn.
It was the
Uh,
20th. Sorry, it's the 20th Valeria.
that was it. See, I was going to go with 20th, and I thought, is that
Yeah,
too obvious? XX, it was the 20th. They
yeah.
built
It
the
was
bathhouse
the
in
20th Valeria Victrix.
Yes, in Prestatyn. Their symbol was the wild boar, as well, I seem to recall, on the tiles that were found on that bathhouse. And the Roman wall that was constructed around the city endures to today, but recently, unfortunately, a section of the wall collapsed. And what's interesting here is, and what we've decided to do in this segment is we've lumped together a few stories specifically examining what we've described as um, the, the price of responsibility. Um, the Roman wall was initially described as, for example, in the Guardian, one of the early stories that came out. It's just said here: the Roman wall collapses in Chester after private building work. Council says excavation by developer has compromised the integrity of the ancient monument. Supposedly, the footings of the wall were compromised by a hole that was dug too far down next to those foundations.
Ah, but then there was a follow up, wasn't there? There was a shock horror because certain people were revealed on local media to have been working there
Yeah,
just before the wall collapsed.
Cheshire Live,
Yeah.
the local newspaper, had a headline saying archaeologists seen working by city walls the day
Da, da,
before the collapse.
da.
And
Yes.
it's interesting here, isn't it? In so much as I sort of raised an eyebrow and
Mm.
commented to you that it's interesting that archaeologists are largely invisible in these processes,
Yeah.
unless it seems they can be pointed at as the people who are responsible for something going wrong. And I can't help but think that people want archaeology to be a responsible profession, but in other instances don't necessarily want to necessarily fully fund archaeology. So, as we've just been hinting at in terms of possible changes to planning regulations post Brexit, but also just generally speaking, on building sites and in other contexts, archaeologists are seen as, oh, you're here? Oh, okay, and people pay you to do this. It's interesting, and yet here, instead of blaming the developer who's looking to produce 19 hotel apartments, apparently, uh, they decide to point the finger at archaeologists. Now, this is obviously the local newspaper, not the national, and that may say something about the local perception of the need for development. I don't know. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I think the first thing we have to say here is in this case and in another very similar case in Lewes late last year, in
Mm.
Lewes in Sussex, where part of the medieval castle wall collapsed in that case. Um, archaeologists, those archaeologists, and indeed the people working on that site and local people have dodged the bullet because we're dealing with two cases where nobody was hurt.
Mm. Mm.
It could so easily have been that people were killed.
Mm-hmm.
As it is, there are going to be investigations, or there is an investigation that's ongoing that hasn't reported yet back in public into this, because the health and safety executive will have been all over it straight away
Hmm.
as to why this was allowed to happen in the middle of a city.
Well, not least because actually the walkway is a public walkway. You can walk around the
Exactly.
city, and if you look at the photograph, particularly in the Guardian article, the entire
Yeah,
width of that walkway collapsed down and into and underneath the fence, essentially down into the yard below.
precisely,
So that so
precisely.
someone could have died. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Mm.
And again, we mustn't ascribe blame in any sense to any party in this, the developer,
No,
the archaeologists, or
no.
anybody else at the moment, because there's we've got no reports to go on. So I think what we can say, the two things to say, and then first of all, thanks to the genius loci or whatever else you believe in or don't believe in, that nobody was hurt in these instances. Um, Further on than that, this kind of thing has happened before.
Hmm. Hmm.
Again, there was a case not that long ago here in southeast London where the gable end of a house collapsed into a site that was being dug out and cleared for development.
Mm.
Um, so these events do happen.
Hmm.
Uh, we've been to have two events involving historic monuments, national monuments, Lewes Castle, the walls of Chester, happening so close together is unusual. But there's, we shouldn't read anything into that. I think it just happens to be happenstance.
Hmm.
But it's a very salutary warning that these places, these locations, these monuments, if they're not maintained, if they're not when they're worked on, if they're not worked on um, with the you know with the right resources put in terms of people, in terms of money, in terms of machinery, in terms of whatever, we're dealing with dynamic and potentially dangerous situations, and we need to be it's a reminder of that. And hopefully whatever the reason for the collapse at Lewes and the collapse at Chester, going forward, anybody working in those kind of situations will be making doubly sure that the surveys have been properly done, that the protections are in place, and that the work's being properly monitored.
Well, and I suppose this is the thing you see is that the reason why the Cheshire Live headline raised my gander a little bit, got my
Mm,
gander, was that it's the notion that archaeologists are tinkering. And that they don't have their own safety measures in place. It looks
yeah,
as though they're looking at some sort of very rough-hewn, cobbled surface in the Cheshire Live photograph,
yeah,
potentially with an abutment, maybe a tower or something that was abutted onto the wall at some point, that they're inside of. But the point being that there are other stories. For example, Sky News this month highlighted 42 skeletons that could date from Anglo-Saxon times, found in shallow graves in Buckinghamshire. The remains were discovered several weeks ago, but an archaeologist report has not been made public by the developers. Again, it's the relationship between archaeology and development that's interesting,
yeah,
along with, and again, we've lumped in another headline here: medieval monument in Rotherham damaged by illegal metal detecting. We're working in this weird realm where archaeologists are guardians, but they're seen as sort of quasi hobbyists. They are subject to the whims of development, but they're also
yeah.
seen as possibly yeah, better than, or a little bit better than, illegal metal detecting. And crucially, the pièce de résistance for this particular section is the news that the Tate put out an advert this month, advertising a salary of £40,000, not for a curator, not for a head of a new exhibition or
Or a
department,
conservator, or
nothing like that. No,
yeah.
but rather for a head of coffee. Now, head of coffee apparently is the person basically who runs the coffee shop.
It's a
40.
really important job.
It is an important job. I agree. I have my lovely coffee here as you do as well. But
Was it the
40.
Victorian Albert Museum a few years back ran an advertising campaign with the nice cafe with a nice museum attached?
They did indeed. £40,000 though for a barista, management barista or whatever, however you want to describe it,
Yeah.
is a large amount of money. The museum did stress that curatorial team leaders can be paid around £50,000. That's an interestingly worded sentence. While assistants may start on 17,524, as guidelines show. Uh, all of this, I think, I wrapped up in this bow of what is the price of responsibility. If you want people to take responsibility for safety measures, for site security, for artifactual security, for the quality of the work that they do, and also in this instance in Cheshire, for the safety of the public, I humbly would argue that you need to pay them at least as much as you pay a coffee shop manager. And
Right.
I
Now,
rest my case, my lord.
look, I don't think there's anybody, and I'm certainly not going to suggest that archaeologists are properly paid in the broader scheme of things. You know, we've got graduates, even people with, if not PhDs, certainly master's degrees or BScs. So I'm working in archaeology who are earning less than the national average,
Yeah.
which is round about 25,000 at the moment. Um,
I mean, heck. I
and
mean, heck. I work in this sector. I
mm,
have a very good first class degree from one of the best, if not the best, archaeological department in the country,
yeah,
and I struggle to earn more than £12,000 a year.
yeah,
And I'm just saying that because also I'm lucky enough to be in a household where there are two breadwinners. But the point is, it's not easy, and we're
no.
working in a sector that's only, as our first section in this month's Watching Brief highlights, is only being more and more squeezed in terms of money and the value of the perceived value of expertise, I suppose.
And it was saying, I mean, as just as we are recording this, the um, University Lecturers Union is balloting its members for further strike action over pay and conditions and pensions,
Mm. Hmm.
which is obviously another branch of, you know, there are many of our colleagues in academic archaeology
Hmm.
who are in similar situations. They're effectively working in the gig economy. The idea that you had a tenure for life in a university is gone, certainly for early career professionals now.
Mm. Mm.
At the same time, they're looking up up the hierarchy and seeing vice chancellors on 200, 300,000 pounds a year,
Hmm. With expenses.
and they say that's the going rate.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Hmm.
um, and so there is and I think we're seeing this across again. Society in general. You had the situation recently again. I'm sorry to raise the B word again, but I'm doing it in context of immigration. You know, there are issues in the workforce in a number of areas in this country, not just in, you know, archaeology takes in a, substan- a substantial number of people
Hmm.
from other countries, including EU countries, not just EU countries, but also other. You know, but we do not have enough homegrown archaeologists who are staying in the business
No.
to fully staff UK sites, particularly with things like HS2 in the pipeline, Heathrow runway 3, if that gets the go ahead,
Hmm.
the A303 extension and Stonehenge, that would be another massive project. You know, we don't have enough people to.
And
In the same way, there are,
the only way to adequately fill that gap, I would suggest, is to have adequate remuneration for people's work and effort.
but also, you know, we have the same situation across other really important, and you can argue in terms of society, perhaps more important areas
Hmm.
of society, such as nursing, such as healthcare workers working in care homes and things like that,
Hmm.
where um, under the proposed rules for that the Home Office has put forward for immigration post December 2020,
Hmm.
the new system that they're going to put in place, you have to have a guarantee of well, at the moment it's £30,000. A government committee suggested cutting that to £25,000. But if you earn less than that, you won't be allowed into the country to
No,
work,
no.
which is absurd.
Hmm.
You know, and it's and that's one of the big debates that we're going to have, and the government is going to have, and we'll probably end up fudging it in some way or other. So there'll be a complex system of certain sectors will be given dispensations. But then what happens if you move, if you lose your job in one sector and want to move to another one? You know, you can just see the way this is potentially going to go. But you're right. I mean, there is no correlation, certainly in archaeology, between qualifications and remuneration
Hmm.
until you get much further, much higher up the food chain.
At which point,
Um,
arguably, it goes ridiculously in the opposite direction. You know, you do have these sort of almost corporate levels of pay for some tiers of management, which I think many archaeologists I see, certainly, for example, on social media, struggle to comprehend uh,
yeah,
the purpose of such tiers.
absolutely. And I think we're also seeing issues with, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, CIFA, has been pushing and pushing and pushing for to make the archaeology a chartered profession and control entry and control standards and so on, which is laudable in many ways.
Hmm.
Um, but they say that will drive up, it will drive up remuneration and so on. There is absolutely no sign of that whatsoever.
No, no.
The archaeologists are at a particular place in the hierarchy of development where, even though their qualifications may be on the level with an architect or a quantity surveyor or somebody like that, they just do not have the same economic pull within the system.
No.
Because partly because archaeology is a tiny part of the budget usually.
Yeah, no, it is, it is. And so I suppose, I guess in conclusion, on the one hand, you could make the argument, well, archaeology in the grand scheme of things isn't as dangerous as as being a medical practitioner in terms of risk of mistakes costing lives, and it's not as important as a lawyer or as important as an architect. You could make that argument, but it's at some point. Uh, One has to ask, do you want archaeologists or not? Do you want them to be well trained and to be accountable? You know, in this instance, if, for example, in Chester, if they are accountable, then they will be held to account. But does their rate of pay and their level of insurance and the perception of archaeology uh, match the amount of responsibility that's going to be put on
Right.
them in that sort of situation?
Right, now, can I just make one point there? That in terms of the overall site safety on a development site like the ones at Chester,
Hmm.
like the one at Chester,
Hmm.
and I'm not citing the one at Chester as an example. I don't,
Hmm.
again, we don't know the full hierarchy of that site, who was involved, what contractors and subcontractors were doing the work there.
Hmm.
But in normal practice, it would not be the archaeologists who were in charge of the overall fabric of the site.
No, but
They
it
would
is
make
but it
requests.
is archaeologists who extend the walls of their trench, who look for the context and who go further down. Stepping, for example, is an issue within archaeological trenches that has to be
Indeed.
accounted for. It's so
Indeed,
as to avoid
exactly,
collapse.
and you and I have both read and observed the Health and Safety Executive guidance on building sites and what you can and can't do in terms of trenching and depth and all the
Hmm.
rest of it,
Hmm.
personal protective equipment and all those other things that
Hmm.
can seem so boring until something like this happens.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and so
Um,
my point is, we,
mm,
we we are expected to, and again, even though I don't actually go on to sites as often as some of my colleagues, we're expected to know this stuff, to be familiar with it. Um, in the instance of, and it is relatively soft pressure, but it is crucial pressure, the public gaze being put onto these archaeologists in this instance. I just find it interesting this month to balance that out with the fact that we also have risks to archaeology in terms of metal detectoring. We have this weird relationship between archaeologists and development, and between archaeologists, development, and budgetary things from government, and then to top it all off, the barista costing £40,000. It's
yes.
interesting to me, and I don't really know. Yeah, again, there's no real answer to this. It's more just a
No.
case of we're presenting it for you this month to talk about and to think about, and
I think it's
presumably to
the
keep
one
an eye
point I
on.
would make, and I think, and if linking this back as well to our breaking news at the beginning of the show
Hmm.
about the petition in Gloucestershire, where a developer is claiming, exerting its right to effectively destroy a substantially preserved Roman building
Hmm.
against the wishes of the local community. It would appear,
Hmm.
because it has, it has planning permission, and that is, and then we're seeing that in the context of the Chester story and so on. I think these stories are becoming more and more common. I just want to go back to very, very quickly to go back to the Sky News story about the Buckinghamshire graves.
Hmm.
When that cropped up on social media, a lot of archaeologists were saying, "Oh, I can't do post." Of course, they haven't reported yet. It takes, it takes a long time to do post X.
Hmm.
They missed the point that what if you looked at the commentary in the paper and on the news sites and so on about it, there was a mistrust in the local community because they weren't told this excavation was going on. They thought that the archaeologists were hiding things from them, and they thought the archaeologists were hiding things from them because the developer didn't want any local community opposition to the development. They were afraid of NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. I don't want those houses built there.
Hmm.
When in fact, as we've discussed before in the context of the story from Somerset last year, it's perfectly legitimate to keep the discovery of burials secret, because burials from pre-Christian periods and even Christian periods have grave goods and are very vulnerable to looting by thieves.
Well, it
So
is. And in the context of that story from Somerset, that was the reason why the archaeologists were reticent.
indeed,
In the context of this story
indeed,
from this year, it seems as though actually there was a certain amount of developers limiting what archaeologists could say.
absolutely,
There is a subtle difference there, but yeah.
absolutely. And my personal view is that um, any archaeologist that signs an NDA on behalf of a developer is actually betraying the core beliefs, the core values of the profession. Because we should be open and offer as much information as possible as soon as possible. The only grounds for keeping quiet are actually site security,
Okay.
not the embarrassment of a developer.
Okay. Well,
And
on that bombshell.
no, well, no. The thing is, the problem is when the developer pays, the piper can pull the tune.
Yes.
Can call the tune.
Yes.
And demand things like NDAs.
Hmm.
Because we have this, you know, there are good things about developer-funded archaeology. The fund archaeology can get done and can get done to a very high standard very
Hmm.
often.
Hmm.
But it can also lead to situations like this where information that should be in the public domain is arguably kept from the public domain out of out of convenience rather than academic or legal necessity,
Yeah.
and that to me is wrong.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. And also pay archaeologists appropriately.